So you're going to look at housing units identified. You're going to look at the number of encampments that we've had to remove. You're going to see in the city where people are living unsheltered. You're going to see a strategy, if you will, sort of a template, if you will, on our housing strategy.
Well, that's Mayor Bruce Harrell giving a preview of what he's going to reveal this week when it comes to his plan on homelessness. What sort of data are we going to see? How will different neighborhoods get prioritized in that plan? Plus, what are the new hybrid meetings for the Seattle City Council going to look like? Are we there yet on establishing a minimum wage for gig workers? And should you paint your own crosswalk in your neighborhood if you're getting fed up with traffic? Plenty of interesting questions and a few answers here on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on Seattle Channel. The views expressed here are my own, and I am joined by none other than David Croman, transportation reporter for the Seattle Times. And David, I saw one of your posts last week on Twitter a bit downhearted as the Mariners sank into last place in the American League West. But since you posted that, a series win over the first place Astros, they're back out of the cellar. I'm wondering if you could post a little bit more angst, like on a regular basis, to get this team going. What do you think, man?
Yeah, right. Well, I guess I'm just concerned because this is the first time I can remember in a long time everyone sort of allowed themselves to get their hopes up. And so far it has not delivered. So hopefully my post marks the turning point.
There we go. I'll bank on that, man. That sounds great. Well, thank you, David, as always, for joining me. Thanks also to our listeners. We're joining you a little bit later on Tuesdays now to make sure we're getting all the latest updates on agendas at Seattle City Hall. I should pass along a note of thanks to City Grind Espresso, our background noise sponsor for the audio podcast. Please visit them on the first floor of City Hall. And thanks especially to our patrons. We can't run the show without you, folks, and so we appreciate that support. Please consider giving, folks, if you haven't already. We will send a Seattle News, Views, Brews coffee mug to you here, to our $10 a month supporters, and you get a special mention on our mug shot of the week. This week, it's Zach, a shot of his mug silhouetted by a cloudy sky at the workplace there, but plenty of blue out there as well. Zach, if we believe in summer, if we believe hard enough, I know it'll come. Thank you very much for the photo. Thanks for supporting Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. Thanks also to Converge Media, too. The video of the podcast airs on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, let's get rolling with right here, right now. Well, here it is. The mayor said he would release a new plan on homelessness by the end of the month. It'll be released Tuesday, May 31st. David, we've heard a lot of plans about homelessness before, certainly over the decades here in Seattle. What I'm understanding with this new plan is it will include locations of encampments, a look at where people who are homeless are connecting with our housing system, and where public safety issues are happening too. I'm just trying to figure out how a dashboard like this is going to affect our public consciousness of homelessness. I mean, does it turn into like a weather report? You got cloudy skies south of downtown, avoid that neighborhood. I'm just trying to figure out what kind of labeling or attention is this going to mean for different neighborhoods?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it's a good question. I think it also kind of shows at, obviously Mayor Harrell's under a lot of pressure to do something about this, but also, a lot of the kind of big thinking around solving homelessness has been turned over to the King County Regional Homelessness Authority. Mm-hmm. They're kind of leading the charge on the sort of, housing and big questions. And so I think what that does leave the city is kind of more focus on these questions of like encampments and location-based issues and public safety and stuff like that. And so, right. Is what we've seen from him, from Mayor Harrell so far in his term, is a focus on certain encampments. And so it's not altogether surprising that his plan would kind of focus on that. For me, the question is always, and will always be, the question of where these folks go, where we put these folks. Right. Is there enough housing? Is there enough shelter? Is there shelter that people want to go to? And so, right. There's over the years, there have been a lot of talks about dashboards and apps and sort of tracking mechanisms. And not to say that stuff's not important. The service providers talk a lot about how it's really important to have kind of a quote by name list.
Yeah. And good data, the whole thing. Yeah.
Yeah. No, obviously that's important, but they also follow that up with, there needs to be more than just kind of tracking. There needs to be housing and places for people to go. So, I guess I'll just be interested to see how this plan kind of dovetails with the larger thinking happening in the King County Regional Homelessness Authority, which is really kind of taking over a lot of the region's response.
Right. I just wanted to delve into one piece of this, though, David. Do you have concerns about this whole concept of linking public safety calls with homelessness or homeless encampments? And I'm not saying that public safety is not an issue around these camps at all. Clearly it is. You got fires, you got break-ins definitely happening. But I've noticed so much painstaking care over the last several years by elected officials in Seattle to try to separate public safety and homelessness, at least somewhat here, such that the conversation doesn't turn into homelessness equals criminal behavior. Do you see where I'm going with that?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and I think that is a tough line to walk. At this, at the same time, the reality is, I think a lot of the people who are kind of most at risk tend to be other homeless folks, and so I guess it can kind of cut both ways. And we know that a lot of what the Seattle Police Department does these days is respond. A lot of the people that they're working with and dealing with are people experiencing homelessness. So exactly where the nexus is between homelessness and public safety obviously is a controversial and difficult topic to address.
Yeah.
If you just look at kind of how the Seattle Police Department spends its time, there does appear to be that.
Yeah.
Some obviously there's some connection there, and as you mentioned, a lot of homeless encampments have had issues with public safety and fires and things like that. So it is. But then you'll also hear from advocates that if you're only focusing on that sort of thing, you're kind of missing the larger point around how folks end up being homelessness, and it is a police response
the right way.
So far the answer is no, because we know that the Seattle Police Department spends a lot of its time dealing with folks who are experiencing homelessness, and we also know that homelessness is still, really, really bad right now. So, I mean, it's sort of we have seen this tightrope walked for a long time, and you're right that I think since the last election it has swung more explicit towards making that connection. Ann Davison was pretty explicit in her campaign for city attorney, and so can you kind of raise these issues while not losing track of the fact that if you're only coming at this from a law enforcement perspective, it's probably not going to solve the issue.
Yeah, so much nuance involved with this, but I know from different people I talk to, they don't want nuance. They just want answers right away, and that's what makes it difficult. I guess one last piece on this. The other question I have about how this dashboard will guide things, how will it guide where funding is going? Because I'm looking at this. There's a meeting coming up later this week for the City Council's Committee on Homelessness. We're going to be hearing from Lehigh, the Low Income Housing Institute, about the work they're doing. And with that, I'm just seeing a few cracks in the armor, if you will, for the King County Regional Homelessness Authority, because the RHA, not all that enamored of tiny house villages. Lehigh, all about them, has hundreds around our area here. RHA saying, well, let's not put a majority of our funding into that. However, these villages are getting some good results. I'm just thinking about this because Lehigh, the way I'm reading this presentation, is pushing back a little bit, and it leads me to this question. How will agencies like Lehigh or the RHA, for that matter, be using this data and trying to spin it when it comes to here's where we need to put our resources?
Right. And I think that has been a tension. I mean, especially with Lehigh for a while. Even with the Barb Poppy report from a few years ago.
From long ago. Yes.
That was this big consultant report that the city spent a bunch of money on to kind of tell them how they should best address this. It's kind of same deal at the time, which is it de-emphasized responses like tiny home villages and kind of quote transitional housing, which is housing that's not street homelessness, but also not where you expect people to live permanently. It was saying that that's not a good investment. And at the time, I was at the press conference when they were talking about this. Sharon Lee of Lehigh was there and kind of, got into it with the conclusions of that report. And so
she's not afraid to mix it up. That's for sure.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think this is kind of a continuation of that. And it's the tension we've seen on the homelessness response for years now, which is, do you kind of move quickly to try and get folks off the street with the risk that this quote temporary solution becomes the permanent solution by default, or do you kind of try and reprioritize and spend money on more permanent supportive housing? I mean, this is a constant tension that we've had all the time, and I think yeah, it's clear that that's not going away with the Regional Homelessness Authority.
No, Lehigh really trying to make the case that the rapid rehousing, you may have heard that phrase used, folks, rapid rehousing, not working nearly as well as its tiny home villages. So we'll definitely see what happens next there. But in other news, I wanted to talk about something pretty big this week, David. The Seattle City Council returning to live meetings this week, kind of. So they have a new hybrid system in place as of June 1st. The council finally using its chambers again, but strongly encouraging the use of face masks for staff and the public. David, I know you've been at council meetings. I have too. How do you see this working out?
Well, I think it's important that they find a way to start having public access in person again. I mean, I do think for advocates of open government and access to elected officials, I don't think that the last 2 years have been great. It's harder. It's easier, I think. The gatekeeping between the public and the elected officials, and I know this as a reporter at least, is stiffer. I used to be able to go to City Hall and hang around and kind of chase people down if I needed to. Can't really do that when everything's online. You got to get approval from the communications department and go through staff, and it's just it's more cumbersome. And so I do think as far as for reporters, it would be a good thing to get back in person, and I think for the public too. That said, of course, you don't want to discount concerns around the pandemic, and especially when the council president is vocal about she has multiple sclerosis and has health concerns, and so I think I'm happy that they're having this conversation about how to get back in person. But their hesitancy also kind of goes to show this sort of weird, ambiguous time where people are behaving as if the pandemic is over, but it's clearly not.
It's so strange to think about 2 years plus of not having city council meetings, and not like they're gripping things where you'd want to be holding onto the edge of your seat, folks, but it's something that's important in terms of outreach. I'm just thinking, though, David, I have not missed the ranting of people like Alex Zimmerman in the front row there, and I'm sure he's coming back at some point. I wonder if we'll see crowds of people with signs, etc. I just kind of I'm looking at this from the perspective of how eager are these council members to get back in the chairs. I mean, that's a piece of this too.
No, I mean it's certainly not a perfect system. No. You do have folks like Alex Zimmerman who are not. Not really a productive use of time in City Hall, and
that's a very kind way to put it. Yeah,
and I do think that there are certain, there's certain biases built into who can show up to city council meetings and who can show up to City Hall and make their voice heard, and certainly, they're not. It is not an equal opportunity access for people to get into City Hall. But I guess I'm just speaking as a reporter from this perspective. It is. Preferable because you just don't when you're not actually there in person.
Communication's totally different.
There's so many things that don't come up. I can't count the number of times when I used to cover City Hall. I'd be sitting in a meeting for something totally else, and I'd catch the eye of one of the council people, and they would you could kind of see like, oh wait, and they'd point to me and be like, hey, I want to talk to you for a second. And
there you go.
I'd hang out afterwards, and then they'd find me and they'd tell me something else that had nothing to do with the meeting, or I'd run into someone and they'd be like, hey, say something that was on their mind that never would have come up in a phone call if we had set up a meeting to talk about X issue. There's a lot of stuff like that I think does happen and is important for reporters. And then I would then argue important for the public too.
Absolutely.
And so, I think it will be a net benefit to be back in person, even if in-person meetings are certainly not, always paragons of democracy or, civic. Civic engagement.
Yeah, right. No, I feel the same way. And this hybrid system will be interesting to see how that pans out, which council members are going to be there, which aren't. I think we've all been to these meetings where we've been in person and maybe someone else has been virtual. It's not a perfect system by any stretch. But again, as you say, David, these are the times we're in. So that starts this week. We'll see what happens for the city council there. And we're also tracking something with the city council there. Are we there yet? Up next, after more than a year of back and forth, is the ordinance to establish a minimum wage for gig workers in Seattle ready to go? We're going to check in on Now Hear This. Gig workers. We have been talking about this a lot over the past few weeks on the podcast, and it looks like Seattle is poised to be the first city in the U.S. to establish a minimum wage and other protections for people who work for DoorDash or Care.com or other app-based companies. That vote set for the full council this week, but it hasn't been without a lot of pushback within the council, and a lot of amendments will be in discussion here. I asked Councilmember Lisa Herbold, the prime sponsor of this measure, about all the pushback within the city council over this gig worker legislation. This was on Council Edition. I hosted this last week on Seattle Channel. Make sure you check it out. She pointed out that a number of the amendments for this bill have actually been brought up by the app companies themselves.
I don't want to suggest that that by amending the bill to reflect their input, everybody's on board. But I think it's also really important that we did incorporate a lot of their input on a lot of different issues.
Well, David, these app companies have been involved for more than a year in this discussion. They've been, quote, involved in the process. But many of those companies will say that involvement hasn't really been meaningful, as in they didn't really get what they wanted out of this. I'm trying to look ahead with this. Do you see that as a warning that these companies are going to sue the city after this passes, or what's your take on how this good old Seattle process played out over the last 12 months plus?
Yeah, well, we know that unlike maybe some, I think of the state legislative process around regulating Uber and Lyft, those companies were involved and then kind of bought into it and supported it in the end. This one, clearly the companies have not bought in and are not supportive. If you look at the homepage of my employer, sometimes they have purchased ads. You probably go there right now and find ads from these companies telling the city council not to pass these things. So, if it does pass, and we've seen this many times with many legislation, the next option is often litigation. I don't know what their argument would be, but I'm sure they have creative lawyers who would come up with something. And so, I expect that this is going to continue to be a fight.
Well, and it certainly was for the city council. Just to jump in here, David, the council actually has this procedure that dictates that usually only committee members can make amendments in legislation. In this case, though, the full council was involved in this discussion. Councilmember Herbold had everybody in, and many of them did make amendments. So with this coming out of committee, you had Councilmember Nelson. She was a yes vote. She was really pushing back against Herbold early with this. And also we had Councilmember Peterson abstain, as he's been known to do over the past couple of years here. It's going to be interesting to see how he votes on the final legislation. I guess my final thought on this, David, as we wrap this up, how much political power do gig workers gain through legislation like this? How much political sway will they hold, or do they hold, over council members? What do you think?
The gig workers themselves?
I guess as a group, and it's tough to see them as a monolith because they're so different, but some thoughts about that.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it is hard. I mean, that to me is always the trickiest thing with gig work regulation, or at least the politics around it, which is you hear there's always multiple organizations who claim to speak on behalf of the workers.
Working Washington, et cetera. Yeah.
But it's just really hard to tell how many workers that is, or what the kind of majority of folks believe or want. And so, I think a lot of the regulation that we see around gig companies in city council is from kind of, labor advocacy groups, Working Washington and things like that, or, with Uber and Lyft, the Teamsters. And so, in some ways it's kind of more, like labor that's been pushing for this. But then, it's always this kind of war of, interest groups who say, this is what gig workers want, and this isn't what they want. And, there are people, actual gig workers, who come up and say, make both these points, but we're talking about a huge variety of reasons for people to get involved in this work, between being their full-time job and then, the kind of more, part-time extra spending money model. And, I think just regulating all of that, we're seeing the kind of hairiness that can surround that.
Oh, yeah. No, all the flexibility that is involved with these different gigs is something that attracts a lot of people to do them. I could do this in my free time, etc. But there are a number of people, and the council is definitely pushing up that part of the narrative, a lot of people who use these gigs as basically full-time work. And so how do those different protections fall into place? I'm going to be very interested to see how this plays out, because the city has said there's something like 40,000 of these gig workers within the city, and this is outside of the Uber and Lyft community there. So we're talking about a lot of folks that are involved with this. how this plays out over the next couple of months, how the different app companies react in terms of what they're going to do legally. I'm going to be really interested to see what happens there. But I did want to touch on one more thing with the City Council this week, David. Another battle, if you will, within the committee for the Seattle City Council, a new rental ordinance promoted by Councilmember Shama Sawant. This would increase the amount of information landlords would have to provide to the city under the Rental Registration Inspection Ordinance, RIO. So basically, landlords would have to give information to a research university of the city's choice, probably UW, I'm just guessing there. That would include information about vacancies, square footage, utilities, the length of a rental agreement. The research university would then study that information, get back to the city with a report that would shape the comprehensive plan up for renewal in 2024, not that far away. I'm just looking at this, David, because council members Nelson and Juarez were no votes with this coming out of committee, perhaps reflecting what they've heard from small landlords. We're getting swamped in regulations. So I'm trying to look at this kind of legislation and how you see it. Is this a nuisance for landlords? Is it an important information gathering tool for the city? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, my sense is maybe this is a prerequisite to something else further down the road.
Yeah.
Maybe
easy, big fella. That's all right. No,
maybe vacancy tax or something like that.
Yeah. Okay.
Because I think that is kind of one of the challenges around some of these housing debates is the data isn't always there to kind of make these comprehensive arguments. So I mean, as a reporter, I'm always interested in kind of studying and kind of what they're able to find here. But obviously, reporting this out is more work probably for the landlords, and we hear from landlord groups that they're already feeling burdened in the city of Seattle, and especially after a couple of years of an eviction moratorium and all that. So I don't know. I mean, it's like I said, I would be surprised if this is just Councilmember Sawant kind of interested in information. I would imagine that this is kind of laying the groundwork for, the more you know, the more you're able to regulate or tax. And
and if I can jump in here, it also feels like comprehensive plan is looming over all of this, which is supposed to be updated in 2024, which I mentioned is not that far away. I know it can be ridiculously boring to talk about that comp plan, but when you talk about the future of the city, when you talk about where upzoning is going to go, where new infrastructure like light rail is going to go, it's a big deal. I'm just trying to look ahead, David, to the big issues of that comp plan in 2024, because we've seen the council lay some groundwork here, getting rid of the single-family zoning designation, and I wonder what's next, and maybe even if this legislation might be a part of that effort.
I think so. One of the things that we see around housing is, there's the kind of urbanist argument that the kind of main driver of some of the housing affordability problems we have is restrictive zoning and not enough development and not enough new housing. And I don't think Councilmember Sawant necessarily disagrees with that. And, she's voted for all the upzones in the past and things like that. But there is this also kind of other argument, which is less emphasis on this market restrictions and more on, folks kind of saying that it's really speculation, investors who are buying houses and sitting on them and not doing anything with them, or kind of people buying up places for Airbnbs or rentals and things like that. And that's this kind of foreign speculation that's driving up housing costs. But the problem with that is we've never really had good information on that, and it's hard to know how big of a role that's actually played. And so again, if you're looking at the comprehensive plan and you're the type of person to argue, not quite make as many arguments about zoning being the driver of this and more about it being, units just sitting there as investment purposes, having this information could maybe help that latter argument.
Yeah, it's going to be a big battle, folks, over the next year or so. It's going to be certainly part of the city council races we'll see next year when 7 seats are open for election there. We're going to see this happen over the next several months. So thank you, David, for breaking that down. All right, up next, you are upset about pedestrian safety in your neighborhood. Check. You're ticked off. The city's not doing enough about it. Check. So is it okay to just make your own crosswalk? Well, David's going to break that down with a story of tactical urbanism. That's a lot more complex than you might think. It's coming up on Transportation Talk. David, you had a great story recently in the Seattle Times about some guerrilla street painters in North Seattle. They painted their own crosswalk at 83rd and Greenwood, and it didn't turn out so well, I guess. What happened there?
Well, I guess it depends on how well it turned out. I guess it depends on who you ask. But
yeah,
I mean, it's this section. There's a popular bakery there, and it's a kind of right in the center of one of the urban villages in the city, the Greenwood, so somebody in the middle of the night, and if people know who, they're not really telling me. Painted this crosswalk, and you knew it wasn't a Seattle Department of Transportation crosswalk because it was just a bunch of big white blocks, whereas the SDOT does the more piano key design.
Yes, got it.
And this was last September, so it actually sat there for
a little while,
almost 8 months, and then the Seattle Department of Transportation came in and they scraped it off, which kind of raised the hackles. A lot of people who lived in the neighborhood and people who liked this crosswalk. And SDOT has since said, well, the plan all along is to put in a proper crosswalk here with traffic signals and things like that. But the residents over there, I think, had just decided that they had heard that enough and were going to do it themselves. And so, it's interesting. I think there was some acknowledgement, even from people who liked that this crosswalk was there, that it would be better for this to be a proper city sidewalk because the paint isn't reflective. There's no signage kind of warning drivers that this crosswalk is coming up. So it
feels like there's a liability issue there maybe too at some point, right?
Certainly, I'm sure that's why I know that's why SDOT decided they needed to scrape this off, because they, as one person told me, if you work in transportation, you spend a lot of time with tort claims and liability.
Right.
But it raised this whole thing of like the Seattle process and how quickly and how seriously the Seattle Department of Transportation is taking pedestrian safety. And so, other folks who lived in the area said, when this crosswalk went in, drivers started slowing down and people stopped blocking the curb ramps and felt like it was actually making a big difference. And so they were particularly angry when SDOT came in and scraped it off. So, I mean, it's a interesting kind of community nugget story, but also tells the bigger picture of around impatience that I think is growing with how quickly pedestrian and bike infrastructure is being built out.
Or not quickly. I mean, I know that's a big concern there. Well, David, thank you for that. And I wanted to wrap up the show talking once again about your gardening exploits. I saw an interesting post from you about the cost of gardening out there that, hey, just put them in the ground. Seeds are really cheap and watch the savings grow. I think you have a slightly different perspective on that. Would you mind sharing that, please?
Yeah, I mean, unless you're like a really efficient, skilled gardener who's been doing it for many years, I can almost guarantee that gardening is more, the food you will eat from your garden is going to be more expensive than what you buy from the grocery store. Maybe in 5 years' time, once we've got it all streamlined. But anyone
or in
who
5 years' time when a tomato costs $10. I mean, there's a few different ways to look at it.
But anyone who's ever built a garden knows that the materials and labor costs are far exceed just going to the grocery store and buying a $2 bag of carrots.
I hear you. But it tastes so much better. You know what I mean?
No, it's not about that. It's about the process and the journey.
This is true. Agreed. It's just, and I got to say, growing up in Southern California where a lot of stuff grew in different ways, coming up here in Seattle, it's a completely different challenge. You should get paid overtime, I would say, my man, for the work that you do in your garden. It's a lot. I mean, you got to put in a lot extra, it sounds like.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll see what comes out of David's garden. He's always growing something. And David, thank you as always for making it work here. Thanks to everybody out there for listening. It's Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your favorite coffee break political podcast where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. This podcast is on all the major platforms. And once again, if you are a listener, please support the show on Patreon, Seattle News, Views, and Brews. It would be greatly appreciated. Thanks for watching on Converge Media 2. We'll see you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2022.